Thank you. That's fine. We're going to talk about how to reduce your carbon footprint. Now, many people have conceptions of what the carbon footprint is. It actually has a very specific meaning, so we're going to talk about that and how it's all done. In essence, a carbon footprint is a way to configure our global impact based upon our activities, the choices we make, the things we do, the things that we buy. In essence, it is a way to describe the impact, the global warming potential of a variety of gases that we cause to be released through our daily activities. Those gases are called greenhouse gases because they have an impact on climate. Many years ago, when I was first trying to explain this to a bunch of fellows who operated a building, I said to them, now, you know, whenever you use electricity, you're causing greenhouse gases to be released. And they said, oh, what does that do? And I said, that can impact the environment and raise our global temperatures. This was 1991, right? And one of them said, oh, I've heard about that, and I know the answer. And he was actually quite straightforward. I thought he was joking when he answered me, but he had his own answer. He says, if there's a real problem with greenhouse gases, the answer is shut down all the greenhouses. He actually thought that's what it meant. I later realized that if we're going to do this kind of thing, we need to back up a little bit and tell people where all this stuff comes from. Otherwise, they have these strange ideas. Each gas, and we're going to list all 6 of them, has what's called a global warming potential. Carbon dioxide is the big kahuna. It's the one that has the major impact. It has a global warming potential of 1. That's how the process is set up. Some of the other gases we're going to talk about have global warming potentials that range from 25 up to 3,000 times the impact of carbon dioxide. Fortunately, they're in small quantities. So even though they're real bad, the overall impact is relatively small. When you combine all those greenhouse gas impacts, all those global warming potentials together, what you end up with is the equivalent carbon, or CO2e. So whenever we talk about carbon, we're talking about this overall impact that it has. Now, if you want to look at the annual impact that an individual or a home or a business has using these different global warming potentials altogether, that's the carbon footprint. It's the overall impact of those gases specified to a home, a person, a family, a business, whatever the boundary is that you want to have the footprint around. Now, here are those big 6 greenhouse gases. As we mentioned, the first one is carbon dioxide. That's the one that comes primarily from burning fossil fuels. It's also a natural item that comes out of various natural processes. The next biggest one, working our way down from worst to the biggest impact to smallest impact, is methane. That's carbon plus hydrogen. It's CH4. Carbon dioxide is CO2. Those are the chemical descriptors. Biggest chunks of methane that come out have to do from agriculture, livestock, gas, oil, and coal mining, all puts out methane. Landfills are a major source of methane because as organic material decomposes, it puts off methane. You can't see it, you can't smell it, but it has a significant impact. It has a much greater impact per pound of methane than does a pound, for example, of carbon dioxide. Next one down is something we don't see very often because it's not something we use every day, but it's primarily in air conditioning refrigerants, is what we call hydrofluorocarbons, or CFCs. Years ago, we used to call it Freon. That was just a generic type of refrigerant. But you have this kind of thing in your car's air conditioning, your home air conditioning, and these have very high potential, very high global warming potential, but fortunately, we don't use as many pounds as we do of fossil fuel. Working our way down, we have nitrous oxide, also from burning fossil fuels, also from various types of industrial processes. Then we have sulfur hexafluoride, which you're never going to deal with. You have nothing to do with this. This is something you find in transformer coolants. Used to be we had PCBs and oil in transformers. All that went away. We have now what's called sulfur hexafluoride. It's also used as an industrial material. One of the places that we do have an impact, though, is in our use of electronics. Perfluorocarbons, called PFCs for short, those are industrial solvents, but also used to make various types of circuit boards. You look at your cell phone, to make all those little circuits in there, you have to use PFCs. They actually are used to clean and characterize and make smooth the surface of those circuit boards. Now, there are other things that impact our global warming potential. Sulfur oxides, there's a variety of those. Those also come from burning primarily things like coal and oil, and also soot, which is also called black carbon. Each of these things have an impact, though as we work our way down, their overall impact compared to carbon dioxide is relatively small. Now, most of you in your residences impact greenhouse gases primarily through production of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides. The first two, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxides, as I say, come from burning fossil fuels. Your boilers, your furnaces, your cars, gasoline, oil, natural gas, those all produce carbon dioxide, and to varying degrees nitrous oxide depending upon the kind of fuel. Most of the methane comes from livestock, natural gas wells and pipelines, your landfills, and decaying plant matter. Merely taking something like leaves and letting it decay in certain ways where there's no air that can get at it, unlike in composting when you let air get at it, can create methane. That's continuously going on all the time. You have methane being created underground from a whole bunch of organic material being squashed and pushed down, and that's even where natural gas comes from. It's from many, many compressions of organic material gradually giving off methane and being caught in pockets. That's how natural gas comes from. Most of natural gas is methane. Now, the contributions that they make to climate change, if we look at it from a standpoint of like a pie chart, the biggest one, of course, is carbon dioxide. This is now carbon equivalent. 82% of your carbon impact on climate, 82% is carbon dioxide. That's the equivalent of it. Next in line is your methane, over here, followed by nitrous oxides, and then the perfluorocarbons. While they are very powerful, there are fortunately few of them in our atmosphere, so they don't have as much of an impact on the overall global warming potential. Now, by our actions, we can impact each of these. We can work to reduce them, we can get them down to a certain point, but then we get to a certain level where we as individuals cannot do much more by reducing our usage of gasoline, by being energy efficient. You get down to a certain point, but then there are ways in which you can further reduce it. There are certain types of products that can be purchased that will actually reduce carbon somewhere else outside your home to counteract the carbon you cannot reduce in your home. We're going to talk about them later on. Now, this overall process of carbon accounting, it starts with the notion of the amount of carbon that the Earth can actually handle. The Earth has been around for a long time. It takes carbon in, it breathes carbon out. When we came along as humans, we kind of upset the balance. And in so doing, we are creating higher levels of carbon that may cause irreversible harm. Climate change, global warming, a variety of impacts. We've worked out ways to try to account for who and what produces the carbon. And a simple inventory system was created. And this is an international system. It's not perfect. It establishes responsibility and it focuses attention on where we can reduce carbon most cost effectively. Now, in your handout, you'll see that there is this URL, this web address. This is the best and simplest carbon footprint calculator for homes and for individuals. It has a bunch of what I would say is finagle factors built in, but it's like a form. You can go to the website, fill it out, and it'll get you pretty close to the amount of carbon that you produce as an individual or for your home or whatever. I'll take you through an example a little later. For those of you that may work with larger facilities like a school or a hospital or something like that, there's a much more sophisticated carbon calculator maintained by the University of New Hampshire. This is the one that some of you may have heard of. Cool Planet is the original name for this. This one took that over and improved it. So this calculator is much more complex, and it's the kind of thing we use professionally when I have one of my customers who's a university, for example, a Stony Brook University, wanted to better calculate its carbon footprint. This is what we use to do so. The process of allocating the carbon. In essence, we try to figure out who's responsible for what. Let me give you an example. Suppose, for example, you want to buy a washing machine. The energy that goes into making the washing machine is not your footprint. That goes into the manufacturer's footprint. In order to get the washing machine to you, that's not your footprint. That's the shipper's footprint. Once you own the machine, this is how the inventory process works. Once you own the machine, all the usage of electricity to run it and heating to heat up the water that's used in it, that's all on you. So the boundaries of a carbon footprint have to do with you when you take possession of something. Things that you can influence carbon outside of it. Suppose, for example, you choose to recycle the washing machine, as we normally do for white appliances, as they're called, when the village picks them up. That metal gets recycled. If, however, you didn't recycle it and threw it away in a landfill, that doesn't count against you because it doesn't produce methane gas, but you do get a credit if you recycle the metal and therefore avoid it having to be used for something else. As I say, this accounting system is not perfect, but it's what we've got. You will find some contradictions in it as we go forward, but it's the way that they put all this stuff together. Now, in order to break out and calculate a carbon footprint, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, worked out various procedures. What they did was they broke out the different sources of greenhouse gases into what they call 3 emission scopes. A scope is a category, a bucket. It's what they call different ways to say, here's where those gases came from. So I'm going to walk you through the scopes, and each one will talk about how to reduce your carbon footprint in the process. This little graphic may help. There are 3 scopes. Scope 1, which they put in the middle, has to do with on-site combustion. That is to say, what you use in your boiler, what you use in your car. Scope 2, and I'll go through this again, Scope 2 is your indirect combustion, for example, your use of electricity, because most electricity comes from fossil fuel combustion. Scope 3 is a catch-all, see all the little individual icons, where they put everything else, they couldn't think of where to put it, so they stuffed it into Scope 3. So let's walk through them. Scope 1, think about your boilers, your furnaces, your cars. That's the first step. That's the first way in which we calculate our carbon footprint. Scope 2, as I say, is off-site combustion. When you use electricity, and I'm always amazed when I talk to some people, I'm a landlord, so I have tenants every now and then. I remember one time talking to my tenants, and he said, the electricity, it comes from the wall, right? I said, well, if you plug into the wall, it'll come out of the wall, but if you open up the wall, you won't see anything in there. I actually had a tenant many years ago, and I've been a landlord for over 40 years, one time put in an electric outlet. He actually cut a hole in the wall. This is a violation of the lease. Cut a hole in the wall, put in an electric outlet, and then called me to complain that he wasn't getting any electricity out of it. And he said, but you told me the electricity comes through the wall. I said, it comes through wires in the wall. But he had this idea that somehow the electricity magically came out of this little outlet box that you stick everywhere. So we had to say to him, no, it comes from power plants. They burn things, they make electricity, they send it to you. That's off-site combustion. The third scope is everything else. This includes a variety of ancillary characteristics of the way in which you use energy and also the way you dispose of waste. Now, for most of your homes, you're going to find that scopes 1 and 2 cover about 90% of your impact. This is what you're responsible for, on-site and off-site combustion. The last 10% can be more tough to calculate, and that's why we have those different carbon calculators, because they take into account other things like your travel, etc. Because even something like flying in an airplane is a scope 3. Yes, I know it's off-site combustion, it ought to be in scope 2 or whatever, but the way they put it together is if you fly in an airplane or you take a train, those are considered to be scope 3, along with recycling. If you have product usage, when you use paints or thinners or certain types of spray materials, they have in them or use different types of what we call volatile organic compounds. When those go off into the air, they also have some form of global warming potential. Fortunately, their volume is not that great, so they all get stuffed into scope 3 because those are many, many small impacts. So let's go through them now one at a time. In scope 1, you can calculate very easily what your impact is because there are these various finagle factors. A gallon of fuel oil burned completely produces about 22.5 pounds of carbon equivalent. A gallon of gasoline, rough number, about 20 pounds. The idea being that if you know how many gallons of gasoline you use, you can figure out how much carbon you're producing from it. These are fairly straightforward. The best ways you can do to try to reduce your scope 1 starts off with energy efficiency, conservation, insulation in the home. There are so many different ways that a home can use energy that the easiest way to get a handle is to go after what's called a home energy assessment. We used to call this an energy audit. People thought that meant you were going to get your taxes checked, so we took out the word audit, put the word assessment in. Same thing. You can get this through either your fuel supplier. Con Ed can suggest somebody to you. The idea is that the state of New York through an agency with a very long name, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, hereinafter known as NYSERDA, will pay those agents, like your fuel producer, your fuel supplier, to come in and do a free energy assessment. It's free for most people. It's based upon income, but you've got to earn a lot of money in order to get charged. It's something like if you have a gross income of over about $200,000, you're going to pay for an assessment. It's not free. But most of us, myself included, do not make $200,000 a year, so the assessment is free, and the state pays the practitioner. Person comes to your house. They do a full and detailed analysis following a state setup process. They even attach into your door what looks like a big propeller. It's a blower. It actually sucks air out of your house to see where air can come in through various cracks and leaks. It's called the blower door test. It's a really good way to find out how much infiltration you have of air going in and out of your house, because that's one of the major sources of heat loss. It also does an analysis, this process that looks at how efficient your boiler is, how efficient your lights, appliances, and you get a report that says, gee, if you spend X dollars on this, here's how much you'll save in dollars and how much in your carbon. And then it works its way down from the most cost-effective to the least cost-effective. And it gives you a set of options to go after. There's no requirement, there's no law says you have to do it, but it shows you like a checklist of which things that'll make you the most money and which ones will save the most as far as global warming potential. Again, it's free. That's the best way to go about it. I could tell you all kinds of little details about flow restrictors and stuff like that, but a home energy assessment is individuated to your home, so I suggest that. There's also an opportunity for you to change fuels, and in some cases, your heating system. Aside from your vehicle, the heating system is one of the biggest things you have in your home that you can impact. I'm stuck with oil where I am. There's an opportunity to use something called B20. B20 is a combination of fuel oil, 80%, and 20% deglycerized soybean oil. It actually reduces your global impact, not by a lot. It's about 10 to 15% better than fuel oil. And while it costs a little more, the state of New York gives you a tax deduction that gives you back the difference in cost if you itemize your taxes each year. So it's a zero-cost option. You can get B20 from Robeson, Schildwachter, and several other fuel suppliers. And it runs just as well as fuel oil. The only thing I would say is I would not suggest it for an outdoor above-ground oil tank. Any place else, indoors, underground, it's fine. But B20, if it gets really, really cold, has a tendency to separate out. So above-ground tanks outdoors, I don't suggest it. Various high-efficiency heating systems. This lady, for example, has the latest in what's called condensing boilers. This device takes natural gas in, does not have a stack like you'd normally see because it even pulls the heat out of the exhaust gases. It's about 95% efficient. Next time you're home, go downstairs and look at the size of your boiler and then say, this mounts on the wall, this is what can now replace it. These are the highest efficiencies you can get, and Con Ed and State of New York will give you money in rebates to do so. If you have an opportunity to go from oil to natural gas, that's also a net reduction. It doesn't take you down by a lot, by about 30%, but again, it's a way to reduce what your impact is. If you're building a new home or doing a gut rehab on a home, especially one where you're going to be doing a lot of insulating and cutting down a lot of your losses, double or triple glazed windows, you can consider what's called a ground source heat pump. This is a device that, under certain circumstances, can reduce your total cost and also reduce your carbon impact, even though it switches to electricity. Heat pumps use electricity. Reduce your impact by roughly 40% relative to oil. These are decisions you make as you go forward in life. I'm not suggesting you do any of this tomorrow or the next day. But next time you're looking at making a major change in your house or buying a house, consider the impact it's going to have on the planet. When we make those kinds of decisions now, they have an impact going 20 or 30 or 40 years into the future. Another thing I would suggest is you give serious consideration to the next car you buy. Cars use roughly the same amount of energy as a boiler in a home, depending upon how often you drive, and the mileage, and that kind of thing. It's the next biggest bang for the buck. There are now a number of different kinds of electric cars, high mileage and hybrid cars. I'm going to talk to you about where you're going to learn about this in a week or two. But the idea is that now there are so many other choices, and the state of New York gives you $2,000 off the price of the car. Federal tax credit, which is still available, is $7,500. So off the top of the cost of an electric car, you can now get $9,500 back. That brings the cost of the car down to being very competitive with standard vehicles. For those who are a little adventurous and don't mind schlepping around large bags of fuel, there's a renewable fuel. It's called wood pellets. This may sound like something from the 19th century, but in the last 20 years, there's been technology developed that uses a standardized size wood pellet. They come in big bags, like 40-pound bags. You can get them at Home Depot. They go into a big hopper. There's an electrical device. Basically, it looks like a big screw. Takes the pellets out, moves them into the boiler. The boiler works just like an oil-fired boiler, burns that stuff very, very efficiently. And out of that 40 pounds of pellets, you come out with about a half a pound of soot in effect, or more likely, I guess you'd call it ash. And that can go into composting, into the soil again. I don't recommend this for most of us because we're all a little on the older side, and schlepping around 40-pound bags of wood pellets may not be fun, but it's an option that exists, and that is the lowest impact from a global warming potential for heating homes. Relative to oil, that's almost an 80 or 85% reduction in carbon output if the wood pellets are made from what we call forest waste. This is, you don't cut down the trees, you pick up the waste on the floor that would normally break down and decompose and produce methane. So you're getting rid of a methane producer by picking up all that wood, not you, but the pellet producer, and they crush it and turn it into pellets. That does take some energy, but when you look at the overall life cycle of it, it's anywhere, as I say, close to 80 some odd or 85% less than if you were going to use oil. But again, it means you've got to schlep around and handle all those wood pellet bags. But the boilers have been around for a number of years, and NYSERDA, that state agency with the long name, they will give you a nice hefty rebate for putting in what they call renewable fuel boilers. That's, yes?
What is the GSHP stand?
GSHP is ground source heat pump. This is like a reverse air conditioner. All air conditioners are a form of heat pump. What it means is that in an air conditioner, you take a refrigerant, something you don't want to leak out, a refrigerant, through a compressor, you compress it, and in so doing, it gives off heat that it has picked up from your home. Once it's turned into a liquid, it then gets circulated back through your air conditioning system, picks up heat, and turns back into a gas. A heat pump is, in essence, pumping the heat from your house out to another location. A ground source heat pump takes a form of process where it pulls heat out of the ground. You go down a few feet in the ground, the earth stays at a relatively constant temperature of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit all year. By passing a fluid through that, you can pick up that heat, cause it to vaporize the refrigerant, and do the opposite of an air conditioner, where now you're bringing the heat into the house instead of dumping it back out. There are technical limitations on ground source heat pumps. It's best in a new home. The temperatures of the water that it can produce may not work with your home. That's why I suggest a new home or rehabbed. But they are an option to consider. They will cost you roughly the same as oil in your home as far as cost per BTU, per unit of heat, but they have a significantly lower impact relative to oil, about 40% less of the carbon impact, even when you take into account the inefficiencies of producing electricity. They're not cheap. It's something you're going to do in a new home. You're not going to go out and buy one right now unless you got about 30 grand. But it is an option to consider as you go forward. Okay, Scope 2. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. When we talk about Scope 2, that's the CO2 equivalent emitted by power plants that make the electricity in your home. This is very specific to your location around the country. Give you an example. If you're in California, using a kilowatt hour produces a little more than half a pound of carbon, 0.56 pounds per kilowatt hour. But what happens when you go to Wyoming? Whoa, much bigger output, 2.1 pounds per kilowatt hour. Who can tell me why?
The source.
And the source is?
Well, probably coal versus something else.
80 to 85% of the electricity produced in Wyoming is done burning coal, which puts out pound for the amount of electricity you get, much more carbon equivalent than the sources that are used in California, which is a mix of natural gas, renewables, hydroelectric, etc. We are somewhere in between there. In Westchester County, where we are, you use a kilowatt hour, you produce about 0.7 pounds of carbon each time. Now, some people think, well, if I use electricity, I don't see any emissions. They don't understand that in the inefficiencies to produce electricity and deliver it, a home that's heated purely by electric resistance heat, not a ground source heat pump, but simple electric coils, it will create more carbon equivalent than if you heated that home by oil, because the oil used at the home is much more efficient as a way to pull out the heat than it is to create electricity, throw away 2/3 of its value in heat, and then transmit it to you and lose some more in the process. So just because you don't see something coming out of a stack does not mean there's no carbon equivalent. Electricity is a relatively inefficient way to use for heat. It does all kinds of other good things, but not a good way to use it for heat. So how do we reduce our Scope 2? If you still have any incandescent lamps in your home, shame on you. There is an LED lamp or a compact fluorescent for every socket. And they're all pretty cost effective now because the state has put in money for it. And they last so much longer than an incandescent that even if you ignore the energy savings, they pay for themselves in reduced lamping. A compact fluorescent lamp or an LED, which is the preferred now, the light emitting diode, will last 20,000 hours. That's the equivalent of 20 to 25 incandescent lamps. The cost for the incandescent lamp alone would be greater over that life cycle than would be over a single LED lamp. We have many things we call vampire loads. These are things like copy machines that are pulling power all the time. You can put them on, or your chargers for your cell phone. Put them on a power strip. Be able to flip off the power strip and turn things off when it's not absolutely needed. There are various timers you can put. I have neighbors that I see at 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm out getting a cup of tea or something. The lights are still on their driveway or something else. They could put a timer on those lights and shut them off, or they could put them on an occupancy sensor, a motion sensor, and shut them off when they're not needed. A lot of people use air conditioning, central air conditioning, as their sole source of cooling. Many of us use that. Sometimes we also use ceiling fans. About half of my house is cooled by ceiling fans. If they move the air sufficiently, usually up to about 80 or 82 degrees outside temperature, that's sufficient for cooling. Above that, feel free to use standard air conditioning. But by getting rid of many of those hours when you'd normally run an air conditioner and run a ceiling fan instead, you reduce the total kilowatt hours you purchase and thereby reduce the amount of pounds per kilowatt hour that you're producing. Energy Star is a process by which many of our appliances are rated as to their energy use and cost. There's usually a yellow label, this is fairly standard now across the country, that comes with an appliance, it's on the outside, and tells you based upon a standardized price for electricity, roughly 10 or 11 cents a kilowatt hour, how much it will cost for that unit to run either through its lifetime or per year. Energy Star is a great way to choose appliances. Almost all your major appliances in this country now have some sort of Energy Star label. If they don't, I don't suggest buying them because there's a good chance it's something that you are going to find is costly. If you have an opportunity to install solar photovoltaic panels, which many people have done, that's a way to get down your Scope 2 as well, because now you're producing electricity renewably. You also have the option in our state to buy what's called green power, renewable power. You can also buy, and we're going to discuss this later, what's called a renewable energy credit, a way to shunt aside fossil fuel in favor of green power. We'll talk about how to buy them in a few minutes. These are all ways in which you can reduce the impact of using electricity. Hold on a second. Right. Scope 3, much more complicated. Fortunately, these gases, while they are, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong direction here. There we are. In Scope 3, you have a lot of little gases, gases that have an impact, but there are less of them. The biggest one that we have normally in our homes may be the air conditioning refrigerant. You also have this in your cars. Most people's air conditioning systems work pretty well. If you have one that leaks, such that you have to get the refrigerant restored or put back on, that's not good. It's best to seal it up, get a new one, because you're putting out items that may have a global warming potential of up to 3,000 times the impact of carbon dioxide pound for pound. I'll give you a simple example. In your car, you probably have an air conditioning system. It probably contains about a pound of refrigerant. Most cars use a type of refrigerant called the HFC 134A. That has a global warming potential of 1,430. If your air conditioning system in your car leaks, and it'll all go out at one time, believe me, it doesn't just sit there, and you leak that 1 pound, that's the equivalent of burning 70 gallons of gasoline. That's the difference. So refrigerants need to be controlled very carefully. Anytime that there's a leak or whatever, deal with it. Methane from landfills. Whenever we dump anything in a landfill,